Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give it one more minute as attendees enter the room, one or two, and then we'll get started. For those of you joining, we will be getting started shortly. Okay. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Executive Negotiation Project at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, thank you for joining us here today. My name is Saira Khan, and I'll be moderating today's panel together with Patrick Vink, who is the research director here at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And we're here to really discuss some of the practical applications of technology and its implications on humanitarian negotiation, how it's done, what challenges remain, et cetera, you name it. And several months ago, Patrick here and I moderated a panel that began to address this intersection. And this really came out of prior research that was being done also in looking at the intersection of technology and negotiation, where we found there was very little being done. And so we had a webinar earlier in the spring, which you can find on HHI's YouTube channel. I will also link it in the chat later today. And we began thinking a little bit about the negotiation space and how it was affected by technology and what the challenges were and what the threats were. And so we talked a lot about digital diplomacy and complex partnerships, as well as ethics and a variety of other topics. So if that sounds interesting, you should definitely take a look back at that. But today we're going to be building on that conversation. And so we have three wonderful panelists joining us today who will talk a little bit more about their own work in relation to technology and how it pertains to negotiation, and what implications that has, a little bit more specifically than our first conversation on humanitarian negotiation. And so with that, I'd like to briefly introduce you to our panelists, and then I will hand it over to them to begin the discussion. So first we have Oscar Sanchez Pinheiro, and he has many expertise ranging from conflict resolution to policy analysis to refugee law, humanitarian negotiation, and really you name it. And he's currently the head of the sub-office of UNHCR in Brasilia, and has spent a lot of time thinking about predictive analytics. And so we'll be hearing a little bit more about the subject from Oscar. And next we have Sarah Miller, who has experience working as a humanitarian aid worker in a variety of contexts in the Middle East and South and Central America. And she has experience in both the emergency response and also the development side of things, and currently works at Mercy Corps as a program officer. And Sarah's done some fascinating independent research also away from Mercy Corps, so we'll be hearing a little bit more about that today. And last but certainly not least, Arati Krishnan. She specializes in strategic and applied foresight for institutional transformation in humanitarian and development futures, and is currently a senior advisor for strategic foresight at UNDP and is affiliate at the Harvard Carr Center for Technology and Human Rights, and has focused a lot of her research on foresight, decolonial tech ethics, and humanitarian tech governance. So this is a pretty incredible panel with very interesting perspectives, if you ask me. And I'd also just like to say that everyone will be expressing their own individual views, not of their organization. But now, panelists, I would like to turn to you. Each one of you has so much experience in the humanitarian and or development context, but your relationship with technology and how you've engaged with it has been different. And so I'm curious to learn a little bit more. If you could please share a little bit more about your work, about the technology in particular, that you've engaged with, perhaps briefly define it, if that's something for our audience here today, and then thinking about its implications for negotiation. How has the technology that you've worked with and others that you know of also, if you'd like to comment on that, how has that affected negotiation, whether it's in past, present, or future? So we'll start there with opening remarks, starting with Oscar perhaps, and then we will open it up to discussion. And before I hand it over, I would like to encourage everyone who is watching to please use the Q&A box as well at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, and we'll be looking at that throughout today's hour. So Oscar, over to you.
Thank you, Saida. Thank you so much, and it's a privilege to be here with you today. Yeah, from my experience, I've been working in the humanitarian sector for 20 years or more now, and I see a huge change. And I think we haven't studied enough or understand enough or talked about enough, the disruption that is happening. I think Peter Maurer, the head of ICRC, said it best in his, I think, his farewell speech or notes, that we're going through a huge technological disruption. And the humanitarian sector is just one of the sectors that's being disrupted. The thing is that we haven't had a conversation to reflect on how this disruption is taking place and where do we want it to take it. I remember negotiating, over 20 years ago in southern Mexico in Chiapas during the aftermath of the uprising of the Zapatistas, where I didn't have contact with, my supervisors for weeks or months at the time. Nowadays, you're probably negotiating and getting, WhatsApp messages from your headquarters, and you're being, the person that is mandating you to negotiate is interacting with you at the same time you're having the negotiations. So it's not like anymore like shuttle diplomacy or shuttle negotiations. You're actually in real time trying to negotiate your space as a negotiator with your headquarters, and at the same time, negotiating with the persons on the ground. So this is just one example of how technology disrupts kind of the mandate of the negotiator. And there are many other examples. At the moment, I'm also, as was pointed, dealing with predictive modeling, and those kind of technologies also have a disruptive kind of element in the negotiation space. Where you can come in with information that is not readily available to other parties. And the idea is that, you try to create that understanding and that confidence on information technology that people still don't trust. And here I'm talking about the use of, for instance, algorithms, that will determine, how many people will come over the border, or how likely the conflict will be, or where the conflict will take place, or where it will take us. And, when you're negotiating with a person, I think, even though we're irrational beings most of the time, it's one thing. But when you're negotiating with somebody that is relying on a mathematical equation or an algorithm, it's a totally different beast. And I don't think many of us are prepared or technically or intellectually able to decipher some of the intricacies of negotiating through or with algorithms or machine learning and these things that are coming up and being used by a lot of parties to the conflict nowadays. So this is just an introduction, and hopefully we could discuss even further. Back to you.
Wonderful, thank you, Oscar. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today talking to everyone. So I'm here today to talk about and contribute my knowledge and research on what are called humanitarian notification systems, which is a set of systems or technological solutions to a problem with civil-military relations and humanitarian military coordination and conflict. So I'm sure that some people are very familiar with what these are and some folks have never heard of them. So to give a very basic definition, a humanitarian notification system is a system through which humanitarian actors can give their movements and locations, their geographic coordinates, to parties to a conflict over the course of active warfighting, in order to prevent them from being targeted unintentionally over the course of the conflict. This is typically, to sort of set the scene, this is typically in the course of ongoing active war, talking about airstrikes and bombings for the most part. I think today we all have a very clear image of what that looks like, and what humanitarians being targeted and civilians targeted in an airstrike situation looks like today. So in order to frame this a little bit and maybe give two brief scenarios. So if I take you back to 2015 in Afghanistan, the US military unintentionally targeted and destroyed a hospital run by Médecins Sans Frontières in Kunduz. This was unintentional. According to the US military, they didn't know that the hospital was there and that it was a humanitarian site. This, along with changing factors and situation in Afghanistan, led to the standing up of a formal notification system in the country. This is a situation where this technological solution seemed to have a very positive effect. I mean, there were obviously technological issues and there's always bureaucratic problems, but in this situation, it helped the parties to the conflict avoid striking humanitarians. Take you to a very different situation, to Northwest Syria, between about 2016 and 2019, where we have hospitals who are in bunkers underground because largely the Russian and Syrian forces were systematically seeking out and targeting humanitarians. The US government had a humanitarian notification system in place with the United Nations, and in order to try and protect and prevent the striking of humanitarian sites, it was expanded to include the Russian Federation and additionally the Turkish government in the system in a more formally codified humanitarian notification system. Unfortunately, it seems, according to a lot of the folks on the ground related to the system, that this data was then misused and used to verify sites and verify targeting, leading to possibly increases or at least verification of humanitarian sites for the purpose of military targeting by the Russian and Syrian forces. This is obviously a very different situation. So in these two scenarios, in the context of humanitarian negotiation, which is what we're talking about today, not just protection and duty of care for staff, but these systems can have very complicated political fallouts. My research focus on the system in Syria, so that's the one I'm most able to speak to and can focus on. But as a result of the standing up of the situation, because of the use of the data for targeting and all sorts of different very complicated factors, led to a very complicated political fallout. Folks couldn't agree on what the system was for, why they were using it. It complicated negotiations for access. It complicated issues of violations of humanitarian law and folks accusing each other whether it was being used for accountability or for protection. And no one from humanitarians on the ground to the United Nations, OCHA was administering the system, to the US government who was pushing for its system, to the Russian Federation who was claiming that they were bombing terrorist sites, not humanitarians, could agree on what the system was for. So I will leave it there for now, but I can bring the perspective of different ways in which a technological system and solution to a problem can be very productive and also be incredibly destructive and disruptive.
Thank you, Sarah. Arthi, please, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me. Great to be in discussion with both Sarah and Oscar. So I'm going to come at this slightly differently. I've worked in the humanitarian sector about 15 to 18 years, so just under 2 decades. And I very particularly and worked with a range of technology innovations, but mostly in disaster environments, previously with the Red Cross and etc. And my research is really focused on the ethics of the use of technology, and really coming at this from the perspective of historically excluded minoritized populations. So not from the perspective of the institution. And it came born from that because I think the ethics of humanitarian action are often fraught anyway. And then when, as Oscar mentioned, we overlay the use of technology in whether it's negotiation or in various humanitarian aid programs, it becomes even more fraught. And in particularly when we're thinking about spaces where automated decision making, we're using that to determine the migratory status and resettlement of vulnerable populations, it does pose a higher level of risk. And the risk is around you're using automated decision making if the purpose is to target separate or distinct somebody to determine population or group characteristics. Or where they completely replace human decision-making processes, and the outcomes of those decisions can harm directly or indirectly the groups that we're meant to be protecting. And it is the opacity that surrounds automated decision-making, predominantly in AI models, that does pose that risk in humanitarian ethics, because of the fact that there aren't actually establishment of actual rules and principles that can be mutually agreed and governed, particularly as ethics are not necessarily enforceable from a legal perspective. So from the perspective of minoritized populations, when we're thinking about how we are collecting information, presenting information in terms of the negotiation that we do, what types of information we're presenting, what harm that might constitute to populations, how are we determining that? We're not necessarily thinking about this from a futures perspective in terms of future harms. We're often trying to solve the problem right in front of us. So 2 examples that I'll draw on that is publicly known, when data on Rohingya refugees were passed on to the Myanmar government without consent. And the second was when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, and all the information and data that was collected was now widely available because it was never considered that this possibility could come to fruition, and there were no protection mechanisms in place. And so what we had were people being targeted, their digital footprints being tracked. So, it gives rise to this question: why are we not asking what could possibly go wrong on the lives of historically excluded, marginalized, minoritized populations that are on the receiving end of these instruments, and not just now, but how this might evolve into the future. And that's really what my research was focused on, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much to all panelists. Patrick, over to you.
Sure. Thank you. I'll repeat it. Thank you, everyone, for your viewpoint. As Saira mentioned at the beginning, this is and I think some of the panelists mentioned as well, while there has been a lot of work on humanitarian technology, on reflection around the ethics of humanitarian technology in the field, its application to negotiation specifically has just been emerging, we can see, and thinking around what it means for negotiation is still limited in the literature. In practice, we see already major impact, but when we did a systematic review, most of what's published is around enhanced communication and the fact that we can now reach people with WhatsApp, which is important, but it's kind of almost the basics of what technology can do. And what we're looking at is really kind of thinking through what are those different and aspects in which technology is changing the way we're negotiating. And Arati, you just mentioned aspects that I think touch on data and technology as kind of the subject or an element, a stakes in the negotiation, like, you know, having access to data. We've seen that in Yemen as well, having access to specific technology, being part of the negotiation. Other aspects that were mentioned by Oscar deal maybe more with the information aspects, the asymmetry potentially that emerged from the use of technology. Also in your discussion where maybe some of the perception of actors using technology, the sense of militarization almost, you know, through HNS, through the use of drones, through the use of almost surveillance type of instruments and tools. So I guess what I would ask you is first to talk from the perspective now of the other side of the negotiation. You kind of talk to us about what the humanitarians are doing and some of the concerns on that side. What about the people that you are negotiating with? Have you seen changes? Do you perceive, like, how do they perceive that use of technology? Are they themselves leveraging technologies? How do you see that changing, and how does it changes how you have to approach negotiation? If I can ask that first. As I always tell my students, I'm very good at random sampling, but I don't want to do it here. So if anyone wants to volunteer to get in first and tackle that question.
Maybe I'll jump in here, though I'm sure, you know, Oscar, Sarah have much more to say on this topic as well. But I want to maybe come at this from a broader angle. One, I was listening to Hugo Slim last night. He's here in New York doing an ethics lecture, and it was wonderful to see him. And you know, one of the points he talked about was that our ideas of the rules that govern humanitarian action, our principles, is up in the air when we think about what is happening now in the world and how our geopolitical environment has shifted so considerably. So what I would argue and provoke here, and I do agree with Hugo on this, is that the rules that we have been governed by, the global rules that sort of have covered us, or, you know, has been the blanket for humanitarian negotiation, the rules of order, the rules of law, etc. Arguably, it's becoming less relevant because it's not necessarily being practiced by all parties today. So I think we do make an assumption that rules and principles and treaties that were designed decades ago, or you know, a few years ago, are still as relevant today and are held in the same esteem and in the same regard as by all actors. And what we have seen is that's not true at all. That order that we once were using to govern is not the order of today, and it's definitely not going to be the order of tomorrow. So if that's the order that we are we're operating under in normal humanitarian negotiation, and then bringing in technologies that are being used in vastly different ways by different actors, despite what their agendas are, we're arguably in a space where it's all kind of up in the air. We're not really sure how these might unfold. And so I think some of the baseline assumptions we have about that all parties will abide to ethical use or do it in good intention, or, you know, not target humanitarians or not target civilians, that's all not I think, you know, we have to have different sets of baseline assumptions. And the use of technology makes the use of information about targeted populations far more quick, far more easily accessible, and not just targeted populations, the people that they are part of their communities, and therefore the circle of harm that can be extended because that information is so readily available. I'll stop there.
I think I might jump in and piggyback off of that, because that, I think, leads very neatly into sort of what I'm thinking about, where the context can depend so dramatically on the use of these technologies and possibly the abuse of them. So again, talking about notification systems, this isn't necessarily a tool for negotiation, but it has a lot of after effects and consequences that can really affect ongoing negotiations for access, negotiations for cessation of violence, whatever is going on in that space. For a couple different examples, when a notification system was stood up in Yemen, when military actors were given these lists, it's a list of humanitarian sites and movements and things like this, and there was huge misunderstanding where at checkpoints, humanitarians were not being able to move because the military actors that were given this list thought that it was a list of permissions. If you weren't on the notification list, then you weren't allowed to pass through that checkpoint. And so that was then an impediment to humanitarian access because you could not pass through that space because the actors did not understand the list they had been given. And so the intention of this protective, okay, well, we know we're not going to target you, as you drive from the roads to Taiz or wherever you're going, wasn't understood. And so that was a simple case of misunderstanding and sort of bureaucratic mistakes. Then if we go back to Syria, we can see that the system was not only used for targeting data possibly, but also it was then used by the Russian government in their excuses and their rationale for why they were targeting who they were targeting. When there were data errors, when a humanitarian actor in the field on their phone didn't understand geographic coordinates, they took the wrong coordinates, they were off by 200 meters, their coordinates were completely wrong, and then they were targeted by an airstrike or a bombing. And the international community said, how dare you strike this internationally recognized to be a humanitarian site. This was a hospital, this was a food distribution center. The Russian Federation then got up and in their briefings before the United Nations said, but look, the coordinates we received were incorrect. Therefore, this was obviously fraud. These were obviously terrorist actors. And that's why we targeted this site, because of the data being incorrect. I could go into more examples in more context, but it's just to say that it is so contextually specific, and this technological solution and the changes has really led to some both on the most basic level bureaucratic and issues with movement and access, and to really more dramatic political fallout in justification of war crimes.
I would perhaps add, that to complement what was said before, that the spaces where the humanitarian space interacts with, normal politics or international politics is diluted because of this kind of, the proximity of technology tools, to bring the front lines closer. And one thing that worries me that I'm looking at right now, for instance, this EU countries and EU entities that have contracted, predictive modelers from the private sector without any kind of, humanitarian understanding or principles or values. And they will take decisions based on those algorithms to determine what type of services or barriers or impediments, for instance, asylum seekers should have getting into the EU. So imagine that a private company now determines, international law or reinterprets international law for EU countries. So this is, huge, because, in a space where usually you will have the UN and you will have NGOs and you will have international law being applied, you have in a private company, and it's not even a company, it's just an algorithm that has been sold to the EU to make determinations about who enters, Fortress Europe, So, and then how do you negotiate with that? How do you tell the EU delegate or the person at the border that no, they're wrong and they should allow these people to come in, that they have a right, when it is an algorithm that's telling them no, that these people should not be here. So I think, just to come back, to your question, Patrick, is that, those, and I think Aditi was right, that, the deconstruction or the reconstruction with different kind of entities about what is perceived to be international norms or agreed international norms in the humanitarian sector is being dismantled or reconstructed with other actors that don't have perhaps the same values or the same, even, I mean, they were for-profit entities, so they don't even have the same aims that humanitarians have. So how do you negotiate with those? Just another example, you know, I was deployed to the Ukrainian crisis in the border countries, and also, you know, the kind of disconnect between data and between access to information in real time. You know, I was working with social media entities that would have very precise numbers of the people that were coming in through the borders. Whereas, you know, people that came into the Schengen environment, you know, you only have one kind of take at the numbers. And then once they're in the Schengen environment, you would not count them again. So governments, you know, when I was negotiating with governments, you know, they would give me one data set, and then I would check with this social media entity, and they would give me another totally different number. And of course, you know, some entities like Alphabet or Google usually check, you know, where you are over 500 times a day. So they, you know, they have very, very precise information where you are at any precise time of the day. Whereas governments, you know, based on their kind of systems, would only technically or based on their capacities, would only take notes of the entries of people from outside their countries once when they come into the border, and that's it. So the kind of, you know, the level of the capacity of information is totally skewed. Back to you.
Thank you. I would really encourage if there is a question for each other or you know, to react to each other. But in the meantime of the chat, I think there's some questions that were addressed specifically with regards to the more negative potential consequences, for example, of humanitarian negotiation systems, and those can be having adverse consequences. But maybe that can be the start of a follow-up question, which would be around kind of those unintended consequences and things that are designed with a specific objective in mind, and then that turn out to be leading to adverse, often negative consequence, very often lead to again, not necessarily well conceived, but then raise important ethical problems and challenges, as we've seen, for example, in the use of cell phone data records that can then ultimately lead you to identify potential employer of refugees, and if that's illegal, then you can target them for law enforcement. So there's a range of applications that can have positive impact, but then ultimately also have the negative component. And in that sense, the technology itself is more about how you leverage it. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how those reflection are approached? Like what are the mechanisms through which consequences impact are reflected? With Oscar, you worked on predictive analytics. So what was the process through which the pros and cons were maybe thought through? Same maybe with Sarah. So what is the formula, not formula, but what's the right process to make sure that you kind of consult, engage, and think through those type of consequences? I hope my question makes sense.
I mean, for me, on the predictive, you know, modeling, the benefits are huge. You know, so if you were to determine how many people will come at what time, you will prevent, you know, what happened to us in Goma, you know, many years ago, where the operation was set up for the arrival, you know, of the refugees to one place, and actually arrive in another place that were, you know, the agencies were not prepared for, and many people died of cholera at that time. So obviously, it makes a lot of sense that, you know, you are prepared. So you are prepared for what might happen. Those are the pros, because, you know, then you become more efficient about the distribution of humanitarian assistance. You're able to provide specific needs. The cons is that you start, you know, relying And this is where, you know, the discomfort by many humanitarians comes in, because, you know, many humanitarians will say, and I had this discussion recently in the Ukraine, preparing for additional influx, you know, humanitarians will say, my gut feeling is that this will happen, you know. But, you know, gut feelings and statistical evidence sometimes they don't match. And sometimes we are quite irrational about the decisions that we make based on guts, based on maybe the time of the day that you had your last coffee and so on. So I believe in statistics, and I believe in the power of data. The problem is that what data do you rely on? So we were using, so we were looking at data that comes through Twitter, Facebook, even listening to conversations on the radio, looking at data trends in terms of economic output, violence in Venezuela. Now, how reliable is that data? So the data of, for instance, COVID and that the government of Venezuela was producing was not reliable at all. So if you use that data set, then you would probably be really skewed on, you know, the push factors that might come out of COVID. So the concept is that, you know, what data sets, and I think somebody posted, you know, a comment there also. How about the excluded? You know, how about the people that don't have access to Facebook or don't have access to the internet? You know, how are they counted? And that's a huge worry, because usually in humanitarian settings, we would mostly or try to at least look after the most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable usually don't have access to the internet or don't have access to mobile phones. So if you only rely on, you know, data points that are provided by, you know, people's ability to access the internet or access, you know, technology, then you might be excluding a whole bunch of people that are probably the most vulnerable. So those are the cons in terms of, you know, the impact to the beneficiaries. Now, I'm not even entering the ethical, and Aditya, I think, is more of an expert than I on the ethical implications of, you know, going and this kind of the predictive modelings. So there is no sphere standards, you know, on predictive modeling. You know, there's no standards at all. So, you know, how do you then, who has given you the authority, you know, to do this algorithm, you know, and to be able to put this algorithm as the true source of information? And this is a huge, you know, debate that we need to open and have, you know, philosophers and other people come into the discussion, because I don't think as humanitarians we really adapt to it. Because most of us as humanitarians are very practical and pragmatic people. You know, we just want to help. But sometimes in that action, you know, to help, you might be causing harm. So that needs to be put into the forefront of the discussion. Back to you.
I can follow on and answer, Patrick, your question about the pros and cons. And I think in my research context in the notification system in Syria, I think part of the problem is that this was never considered. Speaking to kind of like Arathi's points on the use of data and identifying information and how that, you know, with governments getting their hands on that information that they shouldn't have, I think that was also something that came into play with this Syrian context, that organizations had real concerns about anonymity and keeping the identities of their staff, of their locations and things like that anonymous, both because humanitarian organizations operate in vastly different spaces. If you have a single humanitarian organization in Syria operating out of Damascus and also out of Northwest Syria, those are two very different contexts. And if it was known that that organization was operating in both contexts by the Syrian government, then their staff would be targeted. And so anonymity was very important, and this information and this context wasn't considered in the stand-up of the notification system in Syria, and no one had any idea whether their data was anonymous or not. There were situations where it was clear that data wasn't anonymized. No one understood, not even the UN folks who were administering the system could tell you conclusively whether or not the data was anonymous. And so organizations and humanitarians were throwing their names out there in sites in a desperate attempt for some sort of protective anything, a protective layer for their beneficiaries, for their staff, without knowing what information was being shared about them and to whom. And they also didn't know if militaries were then passing this information along to proxy forces. It was really unclear. And so this is a situation where the pros and cons of sharing this kind of data, of collecting this kind of data, and not understanding the format that this data took, just wasn't considered and had some rather dramatic and detrimental after effects. So I'll leave it there, but.
Thank you.
I can come in here. I mean, Oscar and Sarah raised some amazing points here, and I can't hit the like button fast enough. So I just want to perhaps respond to a couple of things here. Oscar talked about that a lot of these technologies, they are designed by private sectors. So technologies fundamentally are wedded to an ideology of capitalism. That's how technologies are designed, and therefore wedded to a market ideology of capitalist dominance, right? So when you take that as the founding principles and then expand that out, I mean, Oscar raised this really perfectly. They're fundamentally now still designed by very small pockets of power in different contexts, predominantly Silicon Valley, the global north, etc. And then we're trying to extrapolate that out and put it in context where it's just entirely different. And as Sarah points out, the use of it is going to be used in very different ways. And as both Sarah and Oscar say, it's not so much the technology, it's that people don't know how to use it, or what what do we do with this and the consequences of it. So technology is designed through one particular ideology without the types of principles and norms that we would normally put or work really hard to embed in our practice and programs, then constructed and then exported out to a different context, can never be fully protective. And it will reflect the philosophies of those that designed it. The populations that we're meant to be serving are rarely, if at all, included in the design of these technologies, nor are they consulted, nor do they know how their data is being used, as Sarah has said. You give your biometrics at one border point, and you do it because you have to give access. Like you do it to give up. You give up your digital identity in order to get aid, but you don't know how that's going to be used down the line at the next border. And we now know that this data, as Oscar also pointed out, is collected so much. You become a data point, a little dot on someone's spreadsheet. It doesn't engender feelings of safety, of belonging, of people fleeing conflict. They just know that they're constantly being monitored. The second point I just want to say here is I say this as an ex-humanitarian practitioner, right? Whenever we wanted to run a program or deploy a particular technology or anything else like that, we rarely did any kind of theory of harm analysis. Right. And it's usually because we're racing against the time, we're racing against the clock, we're trying to get out as quickly as possible, where these become checkbox exercises. So those roles within humanitarian organization that are meant to bind or that are looking at ethics and all of this, they're they sit in different teams separate to the people that are actually on the ground working on this or deploying these types of technologies. And so if in normal programming, we don't do theory of harm analysis anyway, we certainly don't do it for the deployment of technology. And even if we did do any kind of theory of harm analysis, it's based on the here and now. It is certainly not based on, as Sarah put it, how this will evolve into the future. And it's a practice that we're not good at. We're not good at thinking about long-term consequences over different timelines, or we make assumptions about how someone might experience that harm, because we don't do consultations well. So we make assumptions about how people lead their lives, and we make homogeneous blanket assumptions about the fact that if you're Syrian, that's okay, this might be your experience, but what about the different class of society within Syria? What about the different tribes? What about your cultural background? Are you trans? Are you a woman? Are you a woman from a minoritized group? Like, these different types of intersectional identity markers can very much be used against groups of vulnerable populations. And because of our short-term speculative focus of our work, we're very pragmatic. We're trying to get out the door and to save. And I think, again, I come back to my point about we assume that, I guess, we're all operating under the same guidelines, and that's not true. So whatever assumptions we have, or whatever assumptions we were trained under, we need to reimagine those and rethink those, because whenever we think something could have possibly happened, and we've just seen this in the last 2 years alone, it has happened. So, I don't know if I'm an optimist, though I hope, I would love to have hope and joy, but the world order has changed, and the things that we thought would never happen has happened, and we need to keep designing and have ethical considerations for that.
I want to add on to something you just said and pull out something you just said with the contextually specific, and how different context to context, and even within a single context, how granular things can get. Not even looking at gender, religious, sexual identity, any of that, but looking sort of when people take tools and try to scale them up to be universally applicable context to context. And this is something that we see today very specifically with notification systems, that there is this huge push by governments, militaries, to design and implement systems that are widely applicable context to context, that you can take, here is the X guidebook, here is OCHA's to stay and deliver, this is the name of their, their guide, here is their field, SIMCORD field guide for civil military relations in humanitarian context. This is how you stand up a humanitarian notification system. This is how you implement it. This is what it looks like, without a lot of consideration for either eccentricities of and the differences situation and context to context, not even looking at what are, like you said, not everyone's playing by the same rules. Different military actors are going to be playing by different rules and different guidelines, and consider this data differently, what they want to do with it, how they want to use it. And even going more granular to the humanitarian level, is this, if we're in a situation where this data would be protective somehow, does everyone have access to it? Is it a local civil society organization that is doing the work? And would they have access to a notification system? Could they use it? Is it only the international NGOs who are registered UN partners who have access to the system? And then, almost any level you look at it, it's contextually so different. And there's this huge push, as I said right now, to create these universally applicable technological solutions to these problems that are, if you spend 5 minutes, taking apart and picking apart the threads of these very, very complicated, very violent contexts, what you see are people who have very different realities, very different identities, and whether looking from the military level, the humanitarian organizational level, or the people who this work is intended to protect and benefit level, there's nothing scalable.
Can I come back to that as well? Sorry.
Oh, please.
No, fully agree, right? We think about, this is a really simple thing. How we use WhatsApp and Signal, for example, to negotiate, to give information to vulnerable populations, etc. But again, it's premedicated on English being the main language and or the main, Arabic, etc. But the amount of effort that has to go to just translate it to local language that people can feel trust in the information that they're receiving and feel safe is a huge effort, and that organizations like Whose Knowledge, that localization lab are working towards, and it's still an uphill battle for most people. But the second point I just want to talk about here, which reflects some of what Sarah was saying, is there are heaps of guidelines, principles around the protection of data in the humanitarian space, right? I mean, we still have problems with it, et cetera, but there's so much work being done with this. And as both Sarah and Oscar have said, but it hasn't gone, I mean, that's data, that's one element of it. We certainly have nothing around AI. And what we don't have are two things. Anything that talks about the use of these systems, the use of digital systems within the types of governance structures that it exists in, which is coming back to Sarah's point, or that it exists in, the type of system this digital technology or whatever is going to be deployed into. We have no mechanisms to understand that. And the second part of this is that whilst we might be, whilst I guess the designers and makers of a lot of technologies, and when I sit at academic institutions and people talk about, yes, but the human rights framework is what grounds our work, and et cetera, in reality, I would argue that the human rights frameworks, again, do they still hold true in the digital space? Do they still hold true in the type of world that we're existing in? And in, Salil Shetty in 2018, who's the former Secretary General of Amnesty International, he said this of human rights, that human rights often mean different things to different people, and they don't mean anything at all for a good number of people in the developing world. And he further argues that, it's colonialism and early modern day human rights fed upon each other. And so Western homogenous definitions of privacy or the rights to be left alone, our ideas of it get imposed on others because we assume that's how people lead their lives. And this impacts our ability to understand access needs, demographic needs, actually what this looks like. And actually, I think it also stops us from seeing the humanity behind a data point.
So it looks like next time we will plan for a day-long webinar. There's a lot of questions, a lot of comments, and I think this has been fascinating. We've gone from the very, very high level, and your comments, reference to Hugo's, whose work is thought-provoking, of course, controversial around fundamental principles and how we think about these. And there were some questions in the chat about that. I also want, interestingly, this was not necessarily planned, but I think there was a big plug in here for a side set of webinars that we've been running, which is really around how do you support local technology and innovation and engage with communities around technology development. And while, yes, there is the kind of almost caricatural focus on the big organizations, there is also a lot of open source project, a lot of grassroots initiatives that really need support. And so we have a set of case studies and a set of webinars on that topic, and we'll make sure we communicate that to everyone. Also wanted to mention that despite the plethora of guidance, there are really fundamental problems. For example, very little exist in humanitarian data retention. How much and how long should we keep data, and what should be the process to eliminate information? And of course that came to play in Afghanistan and some of these other roles. And so all these point to really fundamental questions around the governance, the principles, the oversight around all these initiatives. And so maybe I'll quickly hand over to Sarah. I think you had a question on that, and maybe we can use that as kind of the concluding comments from everyone, noting that it looks like there's a lot more to be discussed. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. thank you so much first for all the comments that you've made. I've been furiously taking notes and being like, oh, what's the next thing we should discuss? But I think something that again and again was really mentioned is kind of this, what Patrick was just referring to, this almost like streamlined narrative that there's all these challenges, unintended consequences, the fact that, you know, data is being shared in the wrong way, people are unaware, there's misunderstandings, which shouldn't be happening because this is very sensitive and very difficult to be working with. And so I think in closing remarks, trying to think, how do we move forward? I think that, you know, we know that there needs to be more principles, there needs to be rules, there needs to be something that kind of governs. I think what Arthi was also mentioning, like the ideas and principles have shifted, right? And they no longer apply, or they're starting not to apply, and it will continue so, especially with this really rapidly changing evolution of things like predictive analytics. And so what is it that we need to do, we being a very wide community, particularly also to think about these very complex partnerships that were also referenced a few times in terms of the private partners, looking at governments, looking at how data is exchanged. What needs to happen in order to even begin addressing this? Again, things are happening in silos, right? But we've had these big discussions about digital Geneva Convention, et cetera, for years. So what is it that you think would be the good first steps? What needs to go into this in order to push us forward? And I think if you can maybe think about that a little bit, something hopeful maybe, if there is, in closing out this conversation. So I'll stop there and let you speak to that.
I think Arati has seen a presentation I heard that talks about the different futures possible. So this is not, you know, they have kind of a cone of possibilities. And I think data has, or the future, you know, of data has given us huge potentials. So, you know, I don't want to, because many of us, you know, especially if you come from a legal background, you would always caution, you know, about, you know, the private sector and capitalism, you know, coming into the humanitarians, like if the humanitarian sector was an economic kind of system within itself. But let's say those principles about, you know, more hardcore, let's say liberal capitalism, but you have different futures, and the idea is that we could imagine a future where actually technology is used as a tool for the good rather than for the profit. And I think, you know, looking at for instance, the response, especially the incredible response to the Ukrainian refugees in Europe, and how the private sector came together to help them. Just keep in mind, when I was for instance, in Hungary, the number of shelters provided by a private sector that just did a platform on linking people to shelters, sort of like an Airbnb type of thing, was, you know, 5 times what the government was providing at that time, and they did it within a week. So that, I think, the ability for technology to connect people to people is huge, because then the empathetic kind of element that the neighbor, you know, Rati was mentioning the Rohingya, but the Rohingya were firstly and mostly helped in the first month by Bangladeshis, by the local communities. So using the technology to link people to other people that are in need has tremendous potential. As humanitarian negotiators, what we need to do is be able to understand how technology is used, be able to understand, and I think Patrick pointed out that there's no governance system holding it together, and then we need to work really hard to that, in order for us to become better negotiators and that technology to be for the use to benefit the most people. That's what will be my concluding remarks. Back to you.
Concluding remarks, Arthi and Sarah, anything from you?
I mean, I think I want to leave it on a more higher ethical level, so I'll go very quickly so we can leave it really from the top and bigger feelings. I think my final thoughts would be to really beg folks, whether they're work for the private sector in technology development, whether a humanitarian in the field or a policymaker, to stop and consider the context, to really work through the problem, whatever it is, and consider the after. I mean, sometimes we can't predict what after effects or what consequences will be of things we do, but if you're going to stand up a major system, if you're going to be sharing data, if you're going to be using a technological solution to these problems of access and protection and negotiation, that you consider the context and think through the problem, because it can go very, very, very wrong. And then in my own specific context of notification systems, for there to be consensus as far as possible for what systems are for and what data is shared. It's the two really simple, questions to answer that can save a lot of heartbreak and loss of life, essentially. And the hopeful I'll leave with is that people are still trying. The fact that we're sitting here having this conversation, and the fact that these technologies are emerging and being, we're arguing about them and they're being reconsidered, is that people are still trying. Through the course of my own personal research, I talked to folks in Syria who were actively being bombed as we had our interviews. And when I asked, do you want to stop? Do you want to come back later? Are you in any harm's way? Their answer was, I'd rather have this conversation because I want somebody to know what's going on, that these are real people and this is their lives, and but people, in that we're trying, that people are still working through the problems. So pass it over for our higher level ethical considerations.
I don't really know what else to say. I think Oscar and Sarah have captured this so beautifully. I mean, I think I want to say there are, and I would absolutely agree with Oscar here, there are so many opportunities for us to look at how we use AI and these tools for the betterment of humanity, to give birth to a new type of digital humanity. And I also agree absolutely with Sarah that when you think, and look, my job is to look at risk and uncertainty. So I sit in the dystopias of our world. But when I do need hope, I look at where the helpers are and how many of us or how many people are actually highlighting the types of positive use or trying to mitigate or subvert negative use or evil use, and we need to bring those practitioners more into these conversations. I'm excited about the types of research being done. I'm excited about much smaller organizations that are working really hard to ensure that people are not intentionally left behind and they're not locked into future harm. And so, yeah, when I think when we get too lost in the dystopias, look at where the helpers, look for the helpers. That's where I'll end.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I realize we are a bit over the time, so I will just make a final comment, just noting that in the chat, I'm putting a link to, oops, sorry, I wrote the wrong, I wrote an answer to a question. Sarah will just repost maybe a quick link to a survey that we're running. As I mentioned, this is really part of a body of research that we are undertaking at the moment to, sorry, wrong copy and paste doesn't work for me. Maybe Sarah can put back the link. But so we would like to see your views and have your experience on the use of technology and negotiation. And finally, noting that next week on Tuesday, we will have another webinar on broadly on that topic of digital divides and how do we better engage, what our meaningful partnerships look like, what gender representation looks like, and how do you really support local technological innovation in humanitarian action. So I will leave it here with a big thank you to our speakers today. It was fascinating discussion, complex, challenging, and a lot of points. But again, thank you very much for your participation today. And we look forward to staying engaged with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.